Hello and welcome to another video in which we read through an academic paper and discuss contents. This time we're looking at Jun Kyu and Byung-Jun Kim's Two Faces of Decentralization in South Korea. As always, it's important to make a note of the date this article was published, which was April 2018. So at this point this article is nearly 4 years old. Does not mean that it is invalid, it just means that maybe the last 4 years might challenge the statements made in the paper, and especially in light of the coronavirus pandemic, as well as South Korea's responses to that pandemic, which were much more centralized than other nations, especially in the West. The abstract for this paper is a little less usual, but it's laid out in such a way that makes it quite simple and easy to access. So I haven't gone through it too much, mostly because it's laid out in terms of its purpose, design and methodology, findings, and the value of the paper as subheadings of the abstract, which is, as I say, is unusual but is very easy and accessible, so quite nice. But moving in to the actual paper itself, at the beginning we know, obviously based on the title as well as the abstract, that this paper is concerned with the decentralization process in South Korea. So it gives us a useful and operationalizable definition at the very outset, which is a process of transferring resources, power and responsibility from the central to the local governments. Very simple, very easy. There are three aspects of decentralization in this respect. These are administrative, political and fiscal. Administrative refers to the decision-making power, political refers to the political proceduralism, so voting, and fiscal obviously refers to the economic decision-making of local governments. This paragraph gives a very brief, the next two paragraphs give a very brief history of decentralization, which is gone into in more detail a little bit further on in the paper, so does not necessarily require too much attention here. But this paragraph tells us what the paper is concerned with, and obviously that is the administrative and fiscal, the progress of political, administrative and fiscal independence in the local autonomy system of South Korea. So, first major section, decentralization in theory. So we know straight away this is going to be a theoretical paragraph. And it's broken down into economic and political. So, economic aspect. The idea, or the strongest argument for decentralization, is its efficiency. Efficient resource allocation involves public decision making regarding where public resources are to be spent. Okay, gives us a nice little definition. We can put that in green. Now, this paragraph discusses the issue of price mechanisms, which are, broadly speaking, a perennial issue when it comes to public versus private finances, and points out obviously the price in the public sector where a market mechanism does not exist is hard to determine. But as this says, a market price in the private sector is a signal for consumer benefits, but individuals have strong incentives to hide their preferences because of the nature of public goods. So it's virtually impossible to achieve a fair distribution of the tax burden for public goods production. So as a result, the lack of efficient resource allocation in the public sector requires an alternative approach for the efficient provision of public goods and services. Public choice theory is such an alternative in which individuals reveal preferences through the political process, such as voting. And as a result, we assume that a median voter's preference is chosen as a result of popular vote. Now, it's an improvement, but it has two critical limitations, which are noted here. The political equilibrium does not always equal the economic optimum. What that means is that service areas for public goods provision are consolidated, and a disparity between what people vote for and what they want and the actual provision of goods are a political externality. The other drawback is that voting suffers from the absence of a single optimal outcome. So in voting, a number of options are put to the people, but no optimal one is presented. Rather, the options are presented as equal options. T. Butt's theory suggests that a better institution is one in which individuals can be helped to reveal their preference, mostly through decentralization and local autonomy. Basically, empowering local residents to express their choices and give them different methods for doing so. This is called voting with feet. The idea here is that individuals can choose where they live, as well as by essentially treating local governments and local area provisions as products in a marketplace. So that's the economic element of decentralization. The political element of decentralization can be broken down into three. First, decentralization can manifest core values of democracy, such as liberty, equality, and participation. The idea that liberty of residents can be protected through decentralization is that it brings more people into the process and gives them a greater say in their immediate local circumstances. Second, decentralization can be a method of promoting political participation and achieving grassroots democracy. So, connected to the first point, the liberty of residents is protected through decentralization by giving them greater say over their immediate circumstances, and by giving people a greater say, you increase political participation. Third, decentralization can facilitate the development of local governance that is well aligned with the concept of for the residents. In this sense, public goods and services become more responsive to voter needs, which in turn promotes citizen participation even further. So the idea here is that the three different aspects of the political decentralization are connected in a positive feedback loop in which each aspect improves participation and democratization in connection with the other two. As this paragraph says, though, they're not isolated from economic arguments. Decentralization and accountability, in theory, improves the fiscal as well as political responsibility of local governments. Now, this section is important because it sets up the kind of theoretical structure that the rest of the paper works through. You'll see briefly, as I say, that this has a significant historical section of the paper, but the important recognition of the two aspects of decentralization, being political and economic, is used through this paper to judge the effectiveness of decentralization. But to finish off this section, there are three key assumptions for why decentralization is preferable. First, individuals are assumed to know their preferences better than any governing body. Second, local residents should be able to reveal their preferences for public services and exercise choices. And third, individuals' varied preferences are best served by the governing body to which they are closest. Now, this section is quite interesting. It's a history of decentralization in South Korea, beginning with the inception of decentralization and local autonomy. As noted, the modern history of South Korea is presumed to begin in 1945 and is effective from 1948 after a brief period of rule by the US military. As a result, part of the Local Autonomy Act of 1949 was the institution of local elections, the first of which were carried out in 1950. But as the paragraph goes into, this was not necessarily a so-called good faith attitude to decentralization. It was a decentralized process, but it was a way for President Rhee to control local autonomy through promoting his own ruling party officials. In which case, historically speaking, once this was a successful sort of outcome for President Rhee, he then returned local autonomy system to pre-1949, which essentially means its non-existence. And all leaders were appointed by central government. He resigned after 1960, and a new system was introduced in which a completely decentralized system allowed local citizens to elect their representatives, which is explained in this paragraph here. Then we go into what the authors call the Dark Age of decentralization. General Chung Hee Park, who was a military dictator after assuming power in a coup, completely abolished local autonomy, and all local legislative bodies were dissolved. The idea here was that this would be repealed after the country's unification. Of course, we know that Korea remains divided between South and North, so this was never achieved. Importantly, this ended in roughly 1988, after Chung Hee Park's, after a new president was introduced in the 5th Constitution. In 1987, the head of the ruling party announced that they would introduce a new system of local governance. So, whilst this isn't necessarily a political revolution in the sense of a popular revolution, there is civil protest that drives it, and the governing party admits to introducing local government. Then that brings us to the present. There are a lot of criticisms made of the Local Autonomy Act that was originally introduced in 1949 and revised in 1988. As I say, this criticism was a significant problem for the governing regime, but eventually it was the revisions were finalised in 1990, and 1995 is considered the starting point of contemporary decentralisation and local autonomy in South Korea. The positive, or the other important outcome of this, was that it created a vibrant political arena. So that's that section. It gives us a bit of history of the issue, especially in terms of its rise, decline and return. But this means, of course, that there remain some issues. And these current issues are explored in this paragraph here. The main point, which I'm going to put in green here, is that the current local financial system is not well aligned with administrative decentralization trends. So if you remember, the first section of this paper pointed out the theoretical framework of political and economic decentralization and the reliance and relationship between the two. This section goes into the problems of the system in failing to align the financial and political aspects. So, as we know, as we can assume, public affairs are divided into national and local, but the ratio between them is 8-2 in favour of the national. As a significant number of powers are retained by the central government. Admittedly, under the Moo Hyun-ro administration, decentralisation has increased, but as it says here, some local governments refuse to implement delegated national affairs because they are supported by financial decentralizations. I think this is meant to. Granted, I think the sentence is worded a bit poorly, but the point here is that decentralized programs and projects are not financially supported. So, as a result, a lot of these decentralized or devolved projects are just not implemented. As a result, some scholars, especially Kim, argue that true decentralization should not be considered accomplished unless sound fiscal decentralization is established. So we've only really got one half of the story when it comes to decentralization in South Korea. You can't quite see it because you have to turn your head to the side, but this table on page 297 lays out quite nicely the historical periods that mentioned in the article, as well as the breaking down of the types of government, the structure of organisation, the process of election of local government leaders, and the process of election of local council members. So, you can see here this dark age of decentralisation. All local councils were abolished. But coming back to the contemporary problems, according to Chung, there are three main sources of discrepancy between administrative and fiscal decentralization. So we know there's a discrepancy. So this section is explaining why and how. The first point is that there is little room for expanding tax bases in local taxes. Local taxes only account for 22% of total tax revenue, and they do not have the authority to broaden their tax bases. That authority lies with the Ministry of Strategy and Finance, which are part of the central government. And, more importantly, of those taxes that they're allowed to raise, local tax revenue hinges largely on property taxes, which is less likely to increase compared to, for example, income tax and consumption taxes, such as petrol, VAT, and so on. Second, a deterioration of the local tax base is a result of tax exemptions introduced by central government. For example, in 2008, the idea was that following the global financial crisis, the government would be able to spur on reinvestment and recovery by introducing tax deductions on family members and property owners. But unfortunately, the rate of this taxation has never recovered. Third, the increased expenditures on welfare programs in both national and local levels have caused significant fiscal problems in decentralisation. I skipped over this, but if you go back to the point about current issues of decentralisation, many welfare programs are decentralised, but bear in mind the welfare decentralisation and the fiscal decentralisation necessary to support welfare programs are not in alignment. As a result, local governments cannot raise the necessary funds to sufficiently fund their welfare programs. This is an exacerbating issue. So, the current picture of decentralisation in South Korea does not satisfy economic and political rationales that support local autonomy. Local public services may lack the diversity that is essential for reflecting unique local characteristics. Basically, local government has almost no money to fund the projects that it is devolved to it. And they don't have the ability to raise taxes in order to ensure that they do. This statement, or this issue, is summarised here in this statement. Securing local government's independent sources of revenue and consolidating their right to tax are important starting points for creating sound and accountable local financial management. In other words, financial decentralisation is a necessary condition for successful political and administrative decentralisation, which can introduce local governments of the residents, by the residents, and for the residents. It's a famous democratic phrase, of the people, by the people, and for the people. Now, excuse me. This section closes the paper. It's a very short paper, but it is quite dense, or quite full of information. And it essentially amounts to the future of decentralisation. As I say at the start of this video, it would be really interesting to see how far these challenges and implications have been borne out and complicated by the last 4 years. So, the paper, or this section, starts by saying that South Korea was the only country that experienced both both democratization and industrialization after the Second World War. In particular, and I've put this in green because it's particularly interesting, decentralization is a critical element for the country's transition from an authoritarian regime to a democratic regime. Now, the reason I put this in green is that whilst the abstract of the paper points out the importance of this paper, the actual content of the paper has not made much of an emphasis on that. This little statement here, however, is a particularly important one that I think more could have been made of, in the sense that decentralization is considered an essential element of democratization. Now, that might sound obvious, but it's not always the case. In many countries, decentralization can be thought of as complicating democracy because it's undermining a unitary popular identity, such as in Spain, where Catalonia is seen as a separatist movement, independence for Catalonia is seen as a separatist movement rather than a decentralization movement. Anyway, this is why dismantling the old system of authoritarianism is so important for democratic development in South Korea. A couple of really interesting statistics here. 31.2% of South Korean citizens think that decentralization has brought positive influences. It is interesting that it does not go into much more detail, because 31.2% may well be the highest share of the vote, but it's also interesting that means that 68.8% of people do not necessarily think that it's brought positive influences. Again, it's hard for us to know for sure, because there might be, for argument's sake, 20% of people who think that it's brought very positive influences, and therefore is bringing, we're closer to we're over 50% at that point. But unless we know the full details of that vote, that polling, I think it's a little bit presumptuous. What is more interesting, however, is that the policy experts seem in broad agreement, as 56.3% believe that decentralization has brought positive perspectives. As we know from this paper, South Korea, despite being thought of as an example of administrative decentralization, has failed to experience likewise fiscal devolution. And as a result, the effective administrative decentralization is not necessarily all that successful. Finishing off, the paper states here that all innovative and smart solutions should be formulated by collaboration between central and local public officials and citizens, as well as public agencies and civil society. The reason I've highlighted that, and the reason I want to close on that point, is I think it's worth thinking about and connecting statements like that with greater theoretical implications that we've seen in this module. Why is this the best way? Why is this an innovative way of doing it? There are other papers that we've looked at in this course that would give you good reasons for saying so, but there might also be papers and research projects that you've seen that disagree with that statement. That's the end of the paper and the end of this video. Thank you all very much. I hope it's been helpful.